Thank you, Lady. Ms Sturgeon, before the break, we were discussing some of the early decision-making on the part of the Scottish Government relating to the emergence of the pandemic. We talked about advice being provided by Dr Calderwood and others. In that period, do you recall whether you received advice from the then Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Professor Smith?
He was part of the process of giving advice, so during that period, the then Deputy Chief Medical Officer was mainly, I don't think this was exclusively, but mainly the Scottish Government observer at SAGE, for example. So he would be the conduit of readouts, feedback from SAGE. They would come to me in written form, but he was frequently there in person around the table when I was discussing the matters with Dr Calderwood.
Thank you. And we've also obviously heard evidence from Professor Leach, who we've talked about already, the National Clinical Director. Was he providing advice as well at that time?
Undoubtedly he would have been, but it wasn't, as far as I recall, I don't think it would have been coming to me directly from Professor Leach, but I am sure he would have been part of the process of that advice being gathered from different clinicians and different experts to put to me.
The three principal government medical advisors, Dr Calderwood, Professor Smith and Professor Leach, came from an obstetrics and gynecological background, a general practice background and a dentistry background. Is that correct?
Yes.
None of them were trained in virology, epidemiology or respiratory medicine. Is that your understanding?
As far as I am aware, I know that they have varying degrees of experience in public health. Professor Leach in particular has qualifications in public health. Forgive me, I'm not saying this in any way to say these appointments are nothing, but the First Minister is not involved in the appointment of these, so that I wouldn't have been involved in the appointment process for any of these individuals. We've
seen in this module and others that advice was provided to the UK Government by Professor Chris Whitty, who is an expert in infectious diseases, public health, Sir Patrick Vallance, who had a background in clinical pharmacology and had worked in industry dealing with, amongst other things, vaccines. We've obviously seen and discussed some of the evidence that emerged from individuals in the background, certainly in Scotland, Professor Woolhouse in particular. Professor Woolhouse was also in his advice able to draw on discussions he had with other experts, such as Neil Ferguson and others who he mentions. Did you have a concern over this period that the people from whom you were getting advice were not sufficiently expert to deal with the threat?
No, I didn't. The advice I got from all of these individuals, not just initially, but in the case of two of them over the course of the pandemic, I had a high degree of confidence and trust in, and I think that confidence and trust was justified. I was also aware that they were not simply giving advice to me as individuals, operating solely. They were drawing on other sources, Health Protection Scotland, other experts in various aspects of this. And of course, when we get into March 2020, the Scottish Government Covid-19 Advisory Committee is established, which has a range of experts. Professor Woolhouse, of course, was a member of that. And, I remember specifically the membership of that, again, was not selected by me. It was advised to me by Dr Calderwood at the time. And I do recall that she specifically said that she thought it was important to have him on there because she wanted to ensure that there was a diversity of views coming through that we didn't want to have people. Obviously, we were guarding against anything that could be described as groupthink or simply people that had one particular perspective.
But that body didn't exist. It wasn't set up until the end of March and became operational in early April. Is that right? Again, you will have the dates in front of me. I don't have the dates in front of me. I think it met for the first time in late March. And it was set up, established by Dr Calderwood at my request for specific reasons that I'm happy to cover if you wish me to. But before then, again, SAGE was an important source of advice. And although there were
frustrations I had with the SAGE process that led me to ask Dr Calderwood to establish the advisory group, I had great confidence in the scientific advice coming through SAGE. So at no point did I feel that I was not getting good advice. It was an uncertain time. The knowledge of the virus was developing. There was significant doubts and uncertainties around different aspects of how it transmitted, which became less uncertain over time. But I had confidence in the advice I was getting, and I have great respect for and indeed real gratitude for the work that Dr Calderwood, Dr Smith and Professor Leach did in that period, and in the case of the latter two, subsequently to that.
We've seen some evidence to suggest that Dr Calderwood didn't appear to have very much of a plan as regards the testing aspect of the pandemic response. Was that your experience of dealing with her over this?
Forgive me, I didn't hear whether you said did or did not.
The evidence is that she did not have a plan
I wouldn't agree with that, and nor would it necessarily have been on testing solely for the Chief Medical Officer to have that plan. I think I said earlier on, we went from a period in late January to having no capacity whatsoever in Scotland to process COVID tests, to by the 10th of February, I think, if I'm getting that date correctly, to have facilities established in 2 labs, and in the week subsequent to that, capacity rolled out to every health board in Scotland. So there was a plan. I think there are very legitimate questions, which we covered this morning, about whether the pre-existing infrastructure we had in place allowed that plan to develop at sufficient pace. But I would contend the Chief Scientist for Health, David Crossman, was also closely involved in and brought great expertise to the role of developing our testing capacity and the use of testing, which of course was as important as the capacity that we had.
Would it be fair to say that Dr Calderwood was one of the main architects of what there was of a Scottish Government strategy in the period from January to March?
Strategy for testing or strategy for overall?
Overall.
She was a critical part of that. She was the main conduit of clinical advice to me, but that advice was coming from different sources. And she was part of the collective Scottish Government team that was responsible for both devising and implementing the plan to respond to the pandemic. I don't think it would be accurate to say that was her sole responsibility. And while different people would interpret phrases in different ways, key architect, I'm respectfully not sure would properly describe it either.
She resigned on the 5th of April.
Yes.
When did you become aware of the circumstances which led to her resignation? On
the evening of the 4th. The Saturday night. She resigned on the Sunday, if that's the 5th of April. Right. I struggle sometimes with the precise dates. On the Saturday evening, I got a call from one of my special advisors who advised me that they had taken a call from a Sunday newspaper with the story that then emerged on that day.
Were attempts made within the Scottish Government to retain Dr Calderwood despite that report? So I will, as I do for all aspects of the COVID response, but in particular this one, I take absolute responsibility. In the immediate moment, and remember we're in the very early stages of an unprecedented situation, I had 2 considerations in my mind, and I'll end by saying what I think I got wrong in this. Firstly, I immediately understood that there would be significant public anger about this, and that would have to be addressed, and that Dr Calderwood would have to very clearly apologise and be very clear that she had made a mistake, and that the rules apply to her as they did to anybody else. The other consideration was that we were at this relatively early but still very pivotal stage in the pandemic, from a period of decision making that was very fast paced, that we had to respond very quickly to things,
we had begun to settle into, I'm talking internally in government decision-making, more of a rhythm of how we were doing things, of the advice and the decisions that would then lead to. And Dr Calderwood was a very key part of that. She was a conduit of clinical advice to me. I had high trust in her, and she was a key part of the communication effort as well. And therefore I was mindful of how disruptive it would be to suddenly, in those circumstances, lose a chief medical officer. And so I initially thought I wanted to try to achieve two things: address the public anger and make sure there was no doubt at all that she had made a very serious error, but retain what I thought was very valuable expertise and advice in government. I think as the Sunday progressed, I began to realise I couldn't achieve both of those things, and that if I continued to try to achieve the latter of those, I would seriously compromise trust in the government's message, and that the internal ways of working, that was something for the government to deal with, and I had to prioritise the confidence in public messaging. So that led on the Sunday evening to me having a conversation with Dr Calderwood that led to her resigning. I should say, and I want to say this on the record, she had already reached that conclusion herself and made no attempt then to avoid her resignation. And I think it is to her credit that she, at that point, was very clear with me that the public, the confidence in the public messaging had to take priority. And I do think perhaps stands contrast to other incidents, but I think that is to her credit. But it was a very difficult episode in what was overall an incredibly difficult period.
We've seen some correspondence over that weekend, as you described this. She eventually resigned late on the Sunday, the 5th, that tend to suggest that there was a process over that day whereby there was an evolving realisation, I think, that she would end up having to resign. Are you saying, for Ms Sturgeon, that your initial reaction was to try to keep her, but that became impossible?
Yeah, I think I thought wrongly, as it turned out, and I quickly realised this was not possible to achieve both of those objectives, to make sure we didn't have the public confidence in our messaging undermined and keep the Chief Medical Officer in post in the midst of a pandemic. And I perhaps tried to give equal weight to those considerations, but over the course of that Sunday I realised that was not possible, and if I continued to try to achieve the latter, the outcome of that would be the undermining of confidence, and that quickly led to the situation that unfolded on the Sunday evening. But as I say, Dr Calderwood had already, I think herself, come to that same conclusion. So
ultimately, did you tell her to resign, or did you agree that she should? In
point of fact, I said earlier on, the Chief Medical Officer is not a first ministerial appointment. I probably technically couldn't have made her resign, but that wasn't necessary. By the time I spoke to her on the phone on the Sunday evening, I was clear it was an inevitable outcome, and she was clear it was an inevitable outcome. So the conversation really became that is what was going to happen.
We've also seen some internal correspondence involving Professor Smith and others that tended to suggest that the way in which the resignation had been handled had undermined their position, and they felt that it had undermined the confidence that they felt was in them to be able to continue in that role. Was that something of which you were aware?
I wasn't aware of it at the time. Looking back on it and having now seen that correspondence, I suppose that is not surprising. It was as I say, in the midst of a really tough, difficult time for everybody. This was an episode that, I hadn't known Dr Calderwood or worked with her for as long as others had. It was, it was upsetting, the whole circumstance. And so, yes, I can see that perhaps the process that unfolded over that Sunday of trying to achieve both of those things may have given an impression to other advisors that I thought the loss of her would be so catastrophic that they felt that I didn't value their advice or their input. That wasn't the case. I can perhaps see why they might have thought that, but that wasn't the case. I highly value the contribution of all of the individuals who were advising me.
Did that experience to any extent undermine the ongoing relationships of the team that remained in place with you?
It's certainly not in my experience, and I genuinely don't think that was the case. We very quickly, moved to an adapted way of working. Dr. Smith became at that time, acting Chief Medical Officer, and later became Chief Medical Officer in his own right. And yes, there were difficulties over the next few days. We had to adapt to the loss of somebody who had been very central to our response going forward. But I don't think it damaged relationships at all. I think something else I read into that correspondence was that there had been a sense of, because Dr. Calderwood with me had been the key clinical communicator, had Dr. Calderwood not resigned that weekend, we decided to try to establish a very firm point of contact between the public and the government. But that position of her doing the daily briefings with me every day would not have been sustainable, because it would have taken up too much of the timesheet. So we were already planning to move to a situation, which we did anyway, where the clinicians would share that responsibility. I might,
on that particular aspect of that correspondence, it might be read slightly differently, I think, to suggest that the remaining medical and clinical advisory team, if we can put it that way, were of the view that too much reliance had been placed on Dr. Calderwood as an individual and not on the team more widely, and indeed other sources of expert advice. Was that, if that is the correct interpretation of that documentation, is that a fair representation of the way in which advice was taken from medical sources by the government?
I don't think so. I can absolutely see why that would be an interpretation that could be put on that, and it may indeed be what the author of that correspondence meant by it. Dr. Calderwood was the principal conduit of advice to me. She was not the sole author of that advice. I said earlier on, I interacted regularly with Dr. Smith in the period before Dr. Calderwood resigned, so it wasn't as if he wasn't a key part of the response. He was, and a very valued part of the response. And you asked me earlier on about my experience as Health Secretary when we were confronted by swine flu, and I've had, albeit as Health Secretary at the time, although if swine flu had developed differently, no doubt the First Minister would have adopted this role. But I developed at that point a very key working relationship with the Chief Medical Officer, who at that time was Sir Harry Burns. And so again, that was part of the lesson I'd taken from that, the importance of that relationship, of having a clear conduit for advice was important. But of course, she wasn't giving me advice that she was the sole author of. She was drawing on multiple other sources in giving it to me.
But in translating, if you like, those sources of information to you, and her being the person that you're speaking to, there was a risk, was there not, that in that translation the right information might not be getting to you?
There was a risk. If I've given an impression, so, Dr. Smith would not always be, but equally not infrequently be in the room at the same time. It wasn't that she was the only person that I was speaking to. Frequently in the very early days, she would take part, as Dr. Smith did it later, in the calls between the 4 UK CMOs, and come straight off that call and give me information that she had got from the other 3 CMOs. So it was a situation where she may have been the principal conduit of information to me. She wasn't the only person in the room during these discussions, and I was absolutely aware that she was bringing to me information that came from different sources.
Her resignation was it not, Ms Sturgeon, a cataclysmic event for the ability of the Scottish Government to react appropriately to the threat, and also had an enormous effect on public confidence in the government strategy? On both of those, it had the potential to do both of those things. I don't believe it did either. Had Dr. Calderwood not resigned on that Sunday evening, I believe in terms of confidence in the public messaging, it may well have had that impact. I would
suggest that the evidence through public attitudes and public polling after that suggests that it didn't have that effect. I think her resignation stemmed the potential for that. And on the first, it did have a disruptive effect, but it was one that we were able to overcome reasonably quickly and establish ways of working. And, I think I know Dr. Smith stepped up and did a very good job in those circumstances. So I absolutely accept the potential for both of those things to happen. I wouldn't necessarily agree that either of them were the outcome.
Thank you. Sorry to jump around a little in the timeline. I'm going to go a little bit earlier than that, beginning of April. On the 12th of February 2020, there was a ministerial tabletop exercise called Exercise Nimbus, which took place involving representatives of the UK Government, Scottish Government, Welsh Government and Northern Irish Executive. Was this something you were aware of at the time?
I undoubtedly would have been aware of it at a certain level at the time, but I don't think it was something at that point that was particularly high up my awareness scale, if I can put it that way.
You didn't attend it?
I didn't attend it, unless you're about to tell me that I did, and I haven't recalled,
you didn't,
but
as
I'm
we
pretty certain
understand.
I didn't attend it.
Ms Freeman also did not attend it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that your understanding?
Yes, that is my understanding. Yeah.
It was attended by Mr Fitzpatrick, who is a minister in the health area as well. Should either you or Ms Freeman have attended such an event, which was, we heard from Ms Freeman, an event which sought to update pandemic planning in order to apply more specifically to the circumstances of the emerging threat?
I think, forgive me, I haven't, in advance of today, reviewed Operation Nimbus. I hadn't been aware you wanted to question me on this, so I would have to go and review the detail of that to give you, and I'm happy to do so if you wish me to give you an answer about whether, with hindsight, on reflection, I think I should have been at it. Personally, I suspect my answer to that would probably be no. Having a minister, Mr Fitzpatrick, involved in that would not be in any sense abnormal in these circumstances, and he would have fed back through the normal processes in government what the findings and conclusions and any recommendations from that would have been. There would have been, I'm absolutely certain, senior officials in attendance at it as well. I think
Dr Calderwood was at it as well, to be fair.
Dr Calderwood was at it. Then that makes part of my point. I think, and again, we may come on to other aspects of this. I think in government, in normal times, but particularly in the times we were in, not everybody can be at everything. And just because a particular minister or a particular civil servant is not present at a particular meeting doesn't mean that minister is not engaged in the outcome or the deliberations around that meeting.
But it's a matter of priority between conflicting commitments, one imagine.
Most days in government, yes, that is absolutely the case. That there will always be an element of prioritisation.
Would this event not have been, in the circumstances, given the evidence we've heard about the
Possibly.
extent of the threat, something which should have been prioritised more than it appears to have been?
Possibly. I'm not genuinely not trying to avoid answering the question. I've not, in advance of this, reviewed Operation Nimbus, so I don't want to, without having done so, I don't want to be more definitive than I've been. It may well be that what you're putting to me I would answer yes to, and I'm happy to give some written evidence to the inquiry on this point if that would be helpful. Thank
you, Ms Sturgeon. We have seen in a notebook from an individual named Mr Derek Grieve, the Deputy Director for Health Protection Division within the Directorate of Population Health, a number of entries ranging from the 26th of February to the 5th of March, which read as follows. On the 26th of February, it says that he attended the Cobra M meeting with the Cabinet Secretary, Ms Freeman. He noted that it's clear all departments in the UK government are fully engaged and mobilised in a way that the SG simply isn't. The next day, he indicates that despite attempts to encourage them, still no real engagement. They then spent 20 minutes talking about internal SG comms, completely amazed. And even by the 5th of March, he notes, I attended directors' meeting, laid it out thickly, but few believe this is going to be serious. Is that, as far as you're concerned, and as far as you were aware at the time from your position, an accurate understanding of the state of preparedness and urgency amongst directors in the Scottish Government, in particular the observation that it appeared that the UK Government's operation was sufficiently further advanced?
I couldn't comment in any detail on the UK Government's operation at that point, and perhaps I should limit myself to commenting on the government I was responsible for. That wouldn't be my understanding or experience. That said, and I didn't know about these views at the time, Derek Grieve is a civil servant that I have worked with in various capacities over my time in government. Again, he is a civil servant of the utmost professionalism, integrity and skill and expertise, so I would take seriously what he says. I would make two, I suppose, in acknowledging that I can't directly comment on a meeting I wasn't at and a note that I didn't write, beyond saying that was not my experience at the time. I think there's two other things I would say. In preparing for today, it struck me that at a cabinet on, I think, the 10th of March 2020, I make some quite extensive comments about the fact that this is going to be a whole government, whole society challenge and not just a health, I'm paraphrasing. So clearly at that point, it was something I was certainly stressing, that it had to be something everybody saw as their business and their priority. The other comment I would make, which possibly is not fair to ascribe, and I'm not trying to ascribe it to Derek Grieve, but I remember at the start of swine flu, as Health Secretary, that I sense when you're in a crisis that is very much initially focused on health, it is absolutely all you're thinking about. And even people who are thinking about it a lot, but maybe not as much as you, there is a sense of frustration that they're not as seized of it as you might be. And of course, swine flu, thankfully, didn't progress beyond it being largely a health challenge in the way that COVID did. My recollection, my experience, my understanding is that there was certainly an increasing over that period realisation of how serious this was in the Scottish Government, but there was a realisation that this was something that was serious and that was going to affect everybody and every section of our society.
Can we go to INQ 000238-705, please? These are the minutes of a cabinet meeting held the day before the entries that I've started to read out from Mr. Grieve's notes. On the 25th of February 2020, you're noted as being in attendance. Can we go to paragraph 44, please? It says, under any other business, novel coronavirus, the First Minister informed Cabinet that later that day she would be chairing a further ministerial meeting in the Scottish Government Resilience Room to discuss Scotland's response to the global outbreak of the novel coronavirus, Covid-19, about which there would be a fuller discussion at the following week's meeting of the Cabinet. It would be particularly important to ensure that messages to the general public were as informative as possible and couched in appropriate language. Was it appropriate, given the information we've looked at emerging from Professor Woolhouse in particular, that as at the 25th of February, novel coronavirus was being dealt with under any other business with no substantive discussion of what might be done to prevent its spread?
I think if that had been all that note was communicating, I would agree with you. But I was communicating the fact that later that day, I was chairing a meeting of the Scottish Government Resilience Room. That was, forgive me, what date?
The 25th of February.
I started chairing those meetings in 28th, 29th, I think, of January, with one exception. When I'd been visiting flooded areas elsewhere in the Deputy First Minister chaired, I chaired all of these meetings. This was a period where there was significant work ongoing. There was either the following week or the week after that, at Cabinet, there was a very substantive paper submitted and led by Jean Freeman. So I would suggest that that was giving, if that had said, there is there's a global outbreak of the novel coronavirus, we'll keep Cabinet informed, and there was no action behind it, I would accept that. But that, in Scottish Government terms, is very significant action that is clearly in train as a result of that information, and that there would then be a more fully informed Cabinet discussion in the week after that. This was also not the first discussion that Cabinet had about COVID. I think the first discussion was on the 4th of February. And so there would have been extensive Cabinet discussions along the way. And that is an indication to fuller discussions that were ongoing across government.
There's no note of any discussion relating to procuring or building a testing capacity, is there?
Because that one note doesn't describe it, it doesn't. So this is the 25th of February. By the time this note is written, we have already taken the first steps to build testing capacity. Our testing capacity at the end of January, 0. By the 10th of February, two weeks before this note, we had established testing facilities in Glasgow and Edinburgh. I think we very quickly after that established a facility in Tayside in Dundee as well. I don't know whether that would have been before or slightly after this note. So clearly, evidently from the reality of what was happening, there was work to build up testing underway by the time this note was written.
There's no note of any discussion of the current state of building testing capacity, though, is there?
I would, but no, that note suggests there wasn't, but that doesn't mean that work wasn't underway. The Health Secretary would have been leading that work. The Scottish Government Resilience meeting that I was chairing later that day undoubtedly would have touched on that work. And we know from what was happening, had already happened, that work was underway and was progressing. As I said earlier on, the question of whether it was progressing quickly enough is another discussion, but it was undoubtedly progressing.
There's no note of any discussion or information being shared about procuring personal protective equipment, is there?
Again, that does not mean that work wasn't underway. We had, I think, in fact, I think, again, I can't bring it up. Perhaps you can bring it up, but I think one of the first Cabinet meetings, one of the first briefings I received in January 2020 told me about the first release of face masks from the national stockpile. So clearly, again, just because this note doesn't say that these issues were discussed at this particular Cabinet meeting, the evidence, both in documentation but in reality of what was happening, was that this work was underway.
The earliest predictions in January from Professor Woolhouse had involved a prediction of a pandemic fuelled by mild cases with mortality amongst the vulnerable. Scotland was known at this stage to have an elderly and vulnerable population, that there were recognised health inequalities amongst those with protected characteristics and in lower socio-economic groups. Isn't that exactly why a project had been put in place to introduce Public Health Scotland to address those issues?
Could you repeat that question? Sorry.
Yes, certainly. I'm pointing out that the earliest predictions in January 2020 from Professor Woolhouse had involved a prediction of a pandemic fuelled by mild cases with predicted mortality amongst the vulnerable. Scotland had an elderly and vulnerable population with recognised health inequalities amongst those with protected characteristics and in lower socio-economic groups. I've asked you, this was why Public Health Scotland, by this stage, was in the process of being set up to deal with those very problems. Isn't that right?
Yeah, sorry, it was the very final part of the question.
Yes.
I hadn't quite caught. Yet one of many reasons why Public Health Scotland was being set up. Public Health Scotland was due before COVID arrived with us. Public Health Scotland was due to be formally established, I think, on the 1st of April 2020, and that was a long-standing programme of work. I think it's important to say that it is not the case that the Scottish Government only started dealing with these issues when Public Health Scotland was established. The Scottish Government, through many of its pre-existing bodies and processes were acutely and intensely focused on health inequalities and the needs of older people. Public Health Scotland was established because it was thought that having a body of that nature, particularly one that brought the health service and local government more closely together, would be better able to do that, amongst other things.
There's no discussion here, no mention here of any discussion or any information being provided about any steps to try to protect that vulnerable part of Scotland's population.
I know from the work that was underway in the government at that time that all of these issues were being progressed, all of these issues were being worked on. I suspect that, because I know that because not all of that is encapsulated there doesn't mean that wasn't happening.
Okay, well, what steps were being taken to protect the vulnerable part of Scotland's population?
All of the work we were doing to understand COVID, to make sure we were preparing and scaling up facilities like testing, making sure that we were in a position to supply PPE. And I know there were many concerns raised about all of these things. I'm not suggesting all of that worked perfectly. All of that was designed to protect, as far as it was possible to do in the face of a pandemic, the entire population, and within that those who we were beginning to understand were going to be more vulnerable to a virus of this nature. It was part and parcel of all of the work we were doing.
At this stage, the Scottish Government was asleep at the wheel, wasn't it, Ms Sturgeon?
No.
Could I ask you some questions, please, about the COBRA meeting, which took place on the 12th of March 2020? We went through some evidence in this regard with Mr Gove. It's a meeting which was chaired by Mr Johnson. If we could go to INQ 0000562221, please. Could we go to page 8? Thank you. You may recall, Ms Sturgeon, that there was some discussion around this stage as regards Scotland's emerging position, that it was interested in seeking to cancel mass gatherings, which did subsequently happen. At paragraph 15, it says, continuing, the Chair said that the GCSA should use the announcement to set out what stage 2 should be and begin socialising options 3 and 4 to protect the most vulnerable. The general public would not be asked to do options 2, 3 or 4 immediately, but these policies would come in the next few weeks. He respected the Scottish Government's decision to cancel mass gatherings to manage pressure on emergency responders, noting that as the pandemic progresses, this approach may need to be taken by the whole of the UK to protect public services. However, it was crucial for the Government to stick to the sage advice as far as possible. The four nations should try to stick together as one united kingdom. And at page 10, there's a list of actions where it states Chief Medical Officers for all four nations, Department for Health and Social Care and Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport to prepare advice for consideration by COBRA on approach to mass gatherings. And then the decision reached underneath at number 5, COBRA will keep under review the policy towards mass gatherings with particular reference to their impact on public and emergency services. We can see from the first page of this document that this meeting, chaired by Mr Johnson, took place at 1:15 p.m. Do you read that, as I do, to the effect that there was an agreement that COBRA would keep the issue of cancelling mass gatherings under review, and that further advice in that regard would be provided by, amongst others, the Chief Medical Officers for all four nations? I
accept the reading that you have put on the minute. I was at the meeting, and
yes,
there was no doubt in that meeting that the Scottish Government was going to confirm a decision to advise that that day. It was later before we had legal powers to enforce it, but that we were going to advise the cancellation of gatherings of over 500 people. You rightly point to the time of that meeting, 1:15. Just before that meeting, I had taken part in the weekly session of First Minister's Questions in the Scottish Parliament, and I advised Parliament that that is what the Scottish Government was minded to do. We would obviously listen to other views at COBRA, but this was a Scottish Government decision to take. I was in no doubt in that meeting that that is the decision the Scottish Government was going to take. By this time, I was increasingly concerned that we were not moving fast enough to deal with the rate of transmission of COVID. I heard it referred to, I think, perhaps by Mr Gove in evidence to you, that I jumped the gun on mass gatherings. I would counter. I think by this point, none of us were jumping the gun. We were arguably all going more slowly than we should have been. I think the public was ahead of governments at this point in the action they thought was appropriate. My view on mass gatherings, which I set out to COBRA, was that for three reasons I thought it important to take this action at this time. Firstly, that while the medical advice was that open-air events were relatively less risky than others, it was not the case that there was no risk of transmission. And I thought at that stage, given the state of the pandemic, we had to do whatever we could to reduce the risk of transmission. Secondly, I was increasingly concerned at that point about the pressure on emergency services, having to police large events when they were dealing with other pressures associated with COVID. And thirdly, I thought there was emerging a serious disjoint in the messaging of governments, that we were seeking to communicate that this was a very serious threat, but yet saying it was okay for them to continue to go and gather together in big crowded events. And if people saw that it was okay to do that, would they be less likely to follow the other advice we were giving them in the day-to-day business of their lives? Before lunch, you asked me about the rugby match at Murrayfield, and I think there is, as you put to me, an argument that should not have gone ahead. So that was my position. I set it out at COBRA, and I indicated that the government would confirm that decision. Jean Freeman went back to the Scottish Parliament that afternoon to announce, to confirm what I had said at First Minister's questions. And I announced a decision that the Scottish Government had taken, and I would assert very strongly then, and I would now, that having taken that decision, we were perfectly within our rights to take that decision, and I was perfectly not just within my rights to announce it. It was important that I announced it, alongside, which we may come on to, the other important decisions that were taken at COBRA that day, that it was essential the public were given quick and effective information about. Are the minutes wrong then? If what you're saying, if what the reading of that minute is, forgive me, if your reading of that minute is putting a question to me that says I somehow breached good faith in that I did something that was against the agreement in COBRA, there was no doubt in that COBRA meeting. I mean, I think it's not on the page that's in front of me just now, where it says the Prime Minister respected the Scottish Government's decision, or words to... I think it was the passage that I referred to earlier at page 8. Yeah, yes. Which... Yeah, he respected the Scottish Government's decision. I mean, it's clear that he understood we had taken a decision. Well, to be fair, Ms Sturgeon, if one reads that passage in isolation without looking at the subsequent actions, one might conclude that. But one obviously needs to see what's reached by the end of the meeting and the actions, which involved further advice being taken on the issue. All I can say is I was in that meeting. I recall it very clearly. And there was no doubt that that was the decision that I communicated. I tried to persuade the other governments to follow suit. As it happens, they all did, I think, follow suit within 2 or 3 days, because the situation was developing at pace and in a not good direction. I believe the Scottish Government was right to take that decision then. And if I have a regret about that decision, it's not that I took it that day, it's that I didn't take it days earlier. Including in relation to the Rugby International? I tried to reflect in my answers earlier. I suppose what I'm trying to reflect here is how difficult those decisions were, and how to describe now, looking back with hindsight, something as, in very binary terms, right and wrong, I think is not always fair in the nature of the decisions we were taking at the time. But it is one of the decisions that, yes, if I look back on and could take, have my time again, may go the other way. But that match was the weekend before that. So certainly, yes, I think that was, yes, if I have a regret, it is not that I took the decision too early, it's that we took it too late.
You did announce at 3:20 p.m. that day that mass gatherings of more than 500 people will be banned in Scotland. Is that right?
If you're telling me that's the time of day, I did it roughly, yes.
Yes. You also provided other updates from the Cobra meeting, such as the decision not immediately to close schools. You made these announcements before Mr Johnson was due to speak to the public about the outcomes from the Cobra meeting later. What were the reasons for the timing of your announcement of these matters?
Well, I'll give you the reasons for the timing very clearly in a second, but perhaps just to be clear, and I don't mean this in a political sense or in any way seeking to be adversarial. My responsibility as First Minister was to the Scottish people, not to Boris Johnson. I tried and he tried. I'm sure we all tried to work as collegiately as possible. But my responsibility was to the Scottish people. Why did I announce those? The very nature of the decisions we were taking. We were in a pandemic of a rapidly transmitting virus. The nature of the decisions we were taking meant that they had to be communicated quickly and clearly to the public. At this particular point, the 12th of March, my strong sense was that the public were anxious for their governments to act, to do more, to be much more on the front foot. We were in that meeting, as well as the discussion about mass gatherings, we had decided at that meeting to advise isolation of symptomatic cases. That was really important in trying to stem transmission. These were not decisions that were meant to be kept secret. It wasn't just important that they were communicated, it was important that they were communicated quickly. So I would put it that it wasn't that I communicated these things too quickly. Perhaps the UK government were communicating them too slowly and perhaps not doing so with the urgency that at that point was required.
Did you tell the UK government of your intention to make the announcement at 3:20 p.m?
It would have been, I'm certain would have been known. I don't know whether I specifically said. Again, I don't mean this to sound in any way politically adversarial. I have a duty to communicate. This was advice we were giving the public. How were the public meant to know what we were asking them to do if I didn't tell them? In Scotland, if I didn't tell them, and the rest of the UK, other leaders didn't tell them. My expectation, and what I do remember, my expectation was that by the time Boris Johnson would already have spoken out of that Cobra meeting. The media, the public, on that day, I remember, were desperate for information. I guess I was surprised that I spoke before him, not because I went too quickly, because I was surprised at the time I did it, he hadn't.
These obligations of which you speak are not mutually exclusive, are they? One can have an obligation to the Scottish people, which of course you had, but you can also have an obligation to try to do what one can to maximise the efficiency of four nations working, which was the policy at that time. So therefore, would it not have been possible to discharge both of those obligations at the same time? Absolutely,
and I always tried to do it. There was only one occasion that I recall in a Cobra meeting where the timing of respective communications was discussed, and that was on Monday the 23rd of March, the day we went into lockdown. And in that Cobra meeting, there was a discussion about the Prime Minister communicating first, and I agreed and honoured the agreement that I would wait until he finished. This was in the evening, I think, before I did so. At no other point was there, who's going to do it first, or you shouldn't do it before I do. I left that Cobra meeting thinking it important to communicate the decisions that had been taken to the Scottish people, because it involved the Scottish people doing things and not doing things in order to we were in a race against a virus in order to try to stem transmission of a virus. I fully expected the Prime Minister to do exactly the same. I think it would have been wrong and negligent to wait for ages before telling people what that COBRA meeting had decided.
Did you consider that you had a duty of confidentiality as regards the matters discussed at the meeting?
I did not breach confidentiality. I am not bound by confidentiality in a UK government sense, but nothing in this these were Scottish government decisions. The fact that we were all agreeing them in a Four Nations context did not change the fact they were decisions within the power and responsibility of the Scottish Government. I was not breaching confidentiality, and I would go further than that and suggest that given the situation we were dealing with, the whole notion of confidentiality is a bit absurd. This was a virus that was spreading rapidly at this point. We were taking decisions that were about trying to stem the spread of that virus, and the only way those decisions could have the desired effect was if the public knew about them, and if the public knew about them quickly. And therefore, in my view, the responsibility on all of us, I can't speak for Boris Johnson, but the responsibility on all of us was to get out there and tell the people of tell people across the UK what we were asking them to do and not to do in order to, if we'd operated on the basis of these decisions being confidential, then I think self-evidently that would have been a very, very mistaken position to be in.
There was a commitment at this stage by the Scottish Government to seek to promote Four Nations working in light of the fact that the virus was no respecter of man-made boundaries or responsibilities. Is that right?
I had a strong commitment to Four Nations working, even when the detail of our approaches started to diverge. I didn't ever form a view that Four Nations working wasn't important. My understanding of Four Nations working is we aligned our approaches where we could and where we were, for legitimate reasons, taking different approaches. We tried to nevertheless work together, understand each other's position and coordinate where we could. But I had a duty as First Minister of Scotland to the people of Scotland. If I had simply, in order to keep a notion of Four Nations working that I know some people hold to, which is that it should mean we all do this exactly the same at all times and that should be decided by the UK government, I would have ended up, and the Scottish Government would have ended up acquiescing in decisions that we thought were wrong and not in the interests of keeping people as safe as possible. But I had many, and I know Michael Gove spoke about this on earlier Monday, I think he was here, and we worked. I would pay tribute to Michael Gove in particular on these matters. We had didn't always agree, but we had very constructive discussions. I always sought to work as collaboratively as possible within the Four Nations framework, but I couldn't allow that to usurp my duty as leader of a government with particular responsibilities to take the decisions we thought were best in the circumstances. It
would be necessary in order to try and promote the likely success of Four Nations working to work with respect for the other participants in that process. Do you think that's a correct principle?
I do.
You said a moment ago that you considered the UK government's expectation that these discussions would be conducted confidentially to be absurd. Does that suggest any respect on your side?
I don't think it suggests a disrespect. I was making a point about the nature and status of decisions being taken in the face of a spreading virus, and making the point that by the very nature these can't be confidential decisions because otherwise the public doesn't know about them and therefore can't implement them. And that's the point I was making. I always tried to be respectful in all my dealings with the UK government. There were, not just in COVID, but in many things, moments and issues of tension where no doubt they found me difficult to work with. At times I would find them difficult to work with, but I always tried to be respectful and be constructive in those interactions.
Mr Gove gave evidence to the fact that what had happened on that day caused considerable irritation, at least on the part of a number of individuals, including the Prime Minister, on the basis that there was a perception that you had not behaved respectfully and breached confidentiality. Was that a phenomenon of which you were aware at that time?
It wasn't particularly. I suppose I can see why that would have been the case. At that point, the last thing in my mind was I wasn't setting out to irritate anybody, but equally I wasn't I had reached a view, the Scottish Government had reached a view that to try to stem transmission of the virus, we should advise the cancellation of mass gatherings. COBRA had taken a decision that was asking people with symptoms of COVID to isolate and not leave their homes. I took the view that it was vital to communicate these decisions and to communicate them quickly and effectively. I wasn't doing it to irritate anybody, and I'm sorry if that was the effect, but my overriding, I got lots of things wrong in the whole process of this. I don't suggest otherwise for a second, but my overriding motivation and priority was to try to reach the best decisions, communicate those decisions so that the public could comply with those decisions and we could collectively try to stem spread of a virus that was already doing significant harm.
The phenomenon of you making announcements about matters before the UK government would go on to become something of an issue between the governments. Were you aware of that?
Yes, I was. I didn't think then, and I don't think now, it was fair or rational. Fairly early on, I can't remember exactly when, my daily briefings became set at a time of day, I think 12:15, slightly later in the day, when I gave statements to Parliament, because that was determined by parliamentary sitting times. So my public announcements were at a fixed point in the day. The UK government decided to have theirs, and I'm not making any criticism, but they decided to have theirs at 5 p.m. or thereabouts. That was their choice. If they had wanted to speak before me every day, they had the choice of doing that earlier. I was simply trying to communicate decisions to the public that we were relying on the public to comply with. I was trying to do that openly. I was trying to do that as clearly and as effectively as I could. At no point in my thinking was I trying to steal a march on anybody else or trying to get ahead of it. I was simply trying to do my job to the best of my ability.
Your job, however, as we've identified, involved a responsibility to the Scottish people, of course, but also a responsibility to try to promote four nations working. Why was it that those two obligations were not able to coexist?
I don't believe it is the case that they didn't coexist, but in order for me, I have to choose my words carefully here, in order for me not to use the phrase that's been put to me, irritate Boris Johnson, I think I would just have had to adopt a position of doing whatever Boris Johnson wanted me to do. Now, as First Minister, if I thought we will focus here on areas of disagreement or divergence. There was a huge amount of good joint working and alignment and the different governments working together effectively. But where I thought the UK government was taking a decision for England that was not the right one, I would have been negligent in my responsibilities just to go along with that in order to avoid bizarrely irritating people. I suppose another point in this is it's been described, it's often described as if the UK government's position on these things was the orthodox one, and any of the devolved administrations that diverged were stepping out of that orthodox position. That's not, I think, the right way of looking. Often in these issues where the Scottish government was in the language the UK government would use, diverging from their four nations preferred road, we were joined in that by Wales and Northern Ireland. So often Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland were in exactly the same position, but the UK government, as was their right, had decided to take a different position. In effect, they often became the outlier in four nations decision making, not Scotland.
Surely that can't have been the UK government's position, Ms Sturgeon, because in the schedules to the Coronavirus Act 2020, the UK Parliament had granted power to Scotland, we'll avoid the word to diverge, to differ, to take a different path. I'm
not sure I understand the question you're putting to me.
You were suggesting a moment ago that the UK government thought that the way this should work is that their position should be the orthodox one, and there should be some limitation on Scotland's ability to take a different path. The legislation made it clear that the UK Parliament had granted that power.
No, indeed.
So that cannot possibly be the UK government's position.
What I'm saying is often that some of the comments you're putting to me about me being, or others being irritated at things I did.
Those aren't my words.
No,
putting those words.
Forgive me, Mr. I know they're not your words. But that gave the impression that while the legislation was exactly as you set out, when the reality of that manifested itself in different decisions, then somehow that was an irritation. It was not intended to be an irritation. We were all trying to do our best based on the epidemiology, on the demographic and health profile of our countries, to try to take the best decisions we could. I simply make the observation, the first, I suppose, significant policy divergence was in early May over the stay-at-home advice when the UK government decided to move to stay alert. It's often been suggested that that was the point at which the Scottish Government diverged from Four Nations decisions. In actual fact, at that point, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland stuck with stay at home, and the UK Government for England moved to stay alert. I'm just making the point that when things are described as the Scottish Government moved outside of Four Nations decision making, we took the decisions we thought were best, but often we were in the same position as two of the other four governments that made up the Four Nations.
On the subject of the legislation, was it your understanding, or had you received advice about whether the Scottish Government considered that the Scottish Parliament had power to impose restrictions before the enactment of the Coronavirus Act 2020, which came into force on the 26th of March?
I know, I was aware, and we were always very clear that until that act came into force on the 26th of March, 25th, 26th of March, as you say, that you take mass gatherings, until that point, it was advice that we were giving. It was not enforceable until that point. And similarly, I think with the initial stay-at-home advice for a period of a day or two, that was advice until the legislation came into force.
So the position, as you understood it before the enactment of the Act, was that the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament did not have the power to impose restrictions, hence those decisions were issued on an advisory basis?
Yeah, we wouldn't have had the power to enforce restrictions. We, of course, had the power to advise people to do certain things.
Which is what you did over that period. Did the Scottish Government push for an earlier lockdown? The Scottish Government started, so no is the answer to, the simple answer to that, in the sense that we weren't pushing. The advice to have a lockdown really only crystallised through COBRA on the 23rd of March, so no. But as I think we have just been reflecting on in the context of mass gatherings, the Scottish Government was starting to move, or argue that we should be moving more quickly. One example of that is the one we've been talking about, mass gatherings. We also took the decision to recommend the closure of schools slightly, I think, as it happened. Others followed suit again fairly quickly. But at that point, I was of the view we had to start moving more quickly, and started to demonstrate that through the examples I've spoken about. Before I say this, I can't say, and I don't know that anybody can say with certainty what difference it would have made in the overall trajectory of the pandemic and the outcomes of the pandemic. But of the many regrets I have, probably chief of those is that we didn't lock down a week, 2 weeks earlier than we did. You are a staunch supporter of Scottish independence.
I believe that the record will show that to be true, yes.
Yes. It runs through you to your very core, does it not?
It does.
Is it possible, do you think, for you to take decisions on any matter without seeing them through the prism of Scottish independence and your burning desire to achieve it?
Yes, I know for a fact it is, and if I ever doubted that before COVID, although I had other examples of doing that in the job of being First Minister and Health Secretary before that. I have been in politics for 30 years. I've been a lifelong campaigner for independence. I don't think in my entire life have I ever thought less about politics generally and independence in particular than I did during the course of the pandemic, and particularly in those early stages of the pandemic. People will judge, for better or worse, the decisions my government took. I want to say to people and give this inquiry an assurance that none of those decisions were influenced in any way by political considerations or by trying to gain an advantage for the cause of independence. I was motivated solely by trying to do the best we could to keep people as safe as possible. And we did that to some extent, but not to, and perhaps we never could have done it to the extent I would have wished we could have done. And I carry the regret for the loss of life, the loss of opportunity, the loss of education of our young people. I carry the regret of that with me every single day. But in all of the mistakes I made, that I will concede, some I may argue weren't mistakes, I will absolutely assert very strongly that I did not take decisions for political reasons, and I certainly did not take decisions influenced in some way by considerations around the constitutional argument. On the 18th of March 2020, my Constitution Secretary, Mike Russell at the time, wrote to Michael Gove saying that we were suspending all work on an independence referendum. That didn't recommence, apart from reactive work and a particular very focused thing in before the Scottish election in 2021. That didn't recommence until much later in 2021. The government I led focused entirely on trying to do the best we could through COVID.
It's a matter of instinct for you, isn't it, to seek to promote the cause of Scottish independence?
Yes, it is, but perhaps when you suddenly find yourself in a position of being the leader of a government in the face of a global pandemic, you suddenly find that the instincts you thought you had are not the instincts that come to the fore. My only instinct in the early part of 2020, and this remained the case, was to try to take the best decisions I could, and for my government to take the best decisions we could to steer the country through COVID. And I hope that people observing the Scottish Government, observing how I went about things during that period, whatever they think about me, my politics, my government, I hope that any reasonable person will have seen that.
It's a matter of instinct to seek division between the Scottish Government and the UK Government to achieve and promote the cause of Scottish independence, isn't it?
No, it's not.
As you said, the position, as at the beginning of the pandemic, I think you said the 18th of March, was that Mr Russell had written, in fact, to Mr Gove to indicate that campaigning for a second independence referendum would be suspended.
Yes, I think we also requested at that time that the UK Government did likewise around the constitutional project of Brexit, and that was declined. The UK Government never suspended any of its work on Brexit. One of the reactive things that the Scottish Government officials had to do during COVID was respond to consultation on the Internal Market Act, for example.
It was the transition period for Brexit, wasn't it, in 2020? There were... So work was required on that?
Well, I think that is perhaps a matter of opinion rather than fact.
Okay. Could we look, please, at INQ 000214408? Page 13, paragraph 56E. This is the 30th of June Cabinet minutes. An agreement is reached at the end of this Cabinet meeting that it was agreed that consideration should be given to restarting work on independence and a referendum, with the arguments reflecting the experience of the coronavirus crisis and developments on EU exit. The Cabinet agreed on that date, did they not, to seek to promote the cause of Scottish independence by politicising the pandemic?
No, I respectfully don't think that is a a fair or accurate reading of that part. I remember the meeting. There was no particular discussion. This was a Brexit paper. Again, we were having to consider issues around Brexit. We had no choice in that matter. This was a Brexit paper. There was no particular discussion around that recommendation, as far as I recall. We agreed that consideration should be given to restarting work. In matter of fact, work did not restart. It was not consideration that led to that happening. And that is the fact of the matter. We agreed to consider something. I'm not aware of being part of any real consideration, because in my mind there was no prospect of starting work on independence at that time. But in any event, it didn't happen.
Why would there have been any mention of this at all, given Mr Russell's announcement?
I think it would have been very difficult in the context of a debate or a paper on Brexit, perhaps for that not to have, so that would have arisen in the context. This was not a COVID paper that this conclusion was attached to. This was a paper on EU exit. It was a paper on Brexit.
The words say what they say, Ms Sturgeon. Consideration should be given to restarting work on independence in a referendum with the arguments reflecting the experience of the coronavirus crisis.
I appreciate the words say what they say. I'm not arguing with that, but the facts also say what they say, which was that whatever consideration may or may not have been given, I certainly wasn't part of it at that point. And if somebody had come to me after that and said, right, OK, should we consider this and restart work, I'd have said absolutely not. The facts are that no work did restart on independence at that point.
You've told me earlier in other contexts that Cabinet minutes are really the highest source of authority as to what was actually happening. Not in this case, apparently.
Well, I'm not saying they don't reflect an outcome of Cabinet. I'm saying that didn't happen. So we didn't restart work. Whether or not Cabinet had, somebody in the course of a Cabinet meeting had said we should agree consideration of this, the fact is it didn't happen.
A few hours after this meeting, on the same date as these Cabinet minutes, you appeared on your regular coronavirus briefing and said, frankly, anybody who is trotting out political or constitutional arguments is in the wrong place completely and has found themselves completely lost. Is there not a hypocrisy between saying publicly that anyone who is making constitutional arguments during the pandemic is in the wrong place and completely lost, and there having been a decision in Cabinet hours before that there should be consideration of restarting work on the campaign for independence, reflecting the experience of the coronavirus crisis?
That had not been a significant part of the discussion. It was clearly a comment that was made, otherwise it wouldn't appear in the conclusions like that. But I did not leave that Cabinet thinking we were about to restart work on independence, and I would have made my views clear that that was not going to happen if that had been the case. We didn't restart work on independence. We didn't, we had to, over the course of the pandemic, we had to respond to a court case that had been taken about a judicial review that had been taken. Governments have to answer PQs or FOIs. We had to respond to some Brexit, but we didn't. All of the team that had been working pre-COVID on independence and an independence referendum had, at the start of COVID, been redeployed into COVID work.
Sturgeon, that's not a comment. The minutes read, agreed. That means Cabinet agreed, doesn't it? Well, so are you saying you would have overruled Cabinet?
If after that, so let me be clear what I mean. There was clearly some comment made in that Cabinet meeting that said, oh, maybe we should think about restarting work in independence. Remember, this was at a point where we were going into the summer 2020, where cases were falling and...
No, just please focus on the point. It's agreed, it's not a comment. It's an agreement by Cabinet.
But agreed that consideration should be given. What I meant is if somebody had come to me afterwards and said, we've done this process of consideration and we now think we should restart work in independence, I would have said, I don't want to do that. And I would have said to Cabinet, let's not do that because it's not the right time to do that. But I think more materially, that didn't happen. Nobody came to me and said, if that said, agreed to restart work on independence, that would mean something much more than that does. there was not a process of consideration that then saw somebody come to me with a proposal to restart work on independence. And I'm sorry, my lady, I'm genuinely sorry if it sounds as if I'm dancing on the head of a pin here. I don't mean to. But the key point here is that we did not restart work on independence at that point or anywhere near that point.
If it were to be decided on the basis of the evidence before this inquiry that there was a politicisation of the pandemic and that you had used the pandemic as a means of pursuing your goal of Scottish independence, that would be a considerable betrayal of the Scottish people, would it not?
With respect, I don't believe that conclusion would fairly be reached because it's not what I did, and I don't believe there is evidence to suggest...
But you've given your position, Ms Sturgeon, as to whether you did it or not. My question was, if it were to be decided that that's not right,
if I had
that would be a considerable betrayal of the Scottish people, would it not?
If I had at any point decided to politicise a global pandemic that was robbing people of their lives and livelihoods and educational opportunities, and had decided in the face of that to prioritise campaigning for independence, then yes, it absolutely would have been as you described, which is precisely why I didn't do it and wouldn't have done it.
If that's a convenient moment, my lady.
Certainly. I shall return at 3:15. I think I beat most of the public gallery, so just wait a second.
Of course.
Yes, Mr Dawson.
Thank you, my lady. Ms Sturgeon, moving on to a different topic, that of border controls. We heard evidence earlier in the module from Mr Halliday, who is the Chief Statistician to the Scottish Government, that the UK Government and Scottish Government would make decisions about restrictions of people coming into the country, going out of the country as regards visiting others or coming in, based on largely the same data about the threat of an individual country. I think he said that the data would often come through the Foreign Office, which would have contacts in the countries to try and work out what the threat was. Is that your understanding broadly of the evidence base upon which decisions was taken, although of course a different analysis of it might have been undertaken?
Yes, that's broadly my understanding. I think as the matter progressed, the Joint Biosecurity Committee became central to the provision of that data.
Yes. And it's fair to say, is it not, that there were, although not necessarily huge differences between the Scottish position as regards which countries people come in or go out to, there were periods where they weren't quite the same as the UK government. For example, on the 3rd of July, the UK government published a list of 59 countries for which quarantine restrictions would no longer apply to travellers arriving in England from the 10th of July. However, at that time, quarantine requirements remained unchanged in Scotland.
Yes, that would be my broad recollection of that. Generally, I think on international travel, rightly or wrongly, there was more alignment than divergence. I think when the air travel started to be opened up in the summer of 2020, the regulations took effect in June 2020. The key difference at that time was that there was, for a relatively short period of time, Spain was one of the countries that the UK government had opened up what was called at the time a travel corridor with, and for a short period of time Scotland didn't do that. We delayed doing that for a period. I think it was then, Spain was then taken off that by all countries later on. Yes,
it might not be entirely surprising that there wasn't huge difference if we're avoiding the word divergence, because it was based on the same data, although the essential point I'm trying to make is that the Scottish Government had, in terms of its devolved public health responsibilities and indeed responsibilities which had been given to it under the 2020 Act, it had the power to control that for Scotland.
Yes, I think borders are one of these areas where the interface between devolved and reserved responsibilities is particularly complex. So the Scottish Government, I think under the Public Health Act, 2008, Section 94, I think to be precise, has the ability to put limitations or restrictions on people coming into the country for public health grounds. So that's a statutory position. I think practically we rely on Border Force, which is a reserved organisation, yes, to deliver that in a practical sense. There's then obviously the case that, as we encountered later on, that if there were differences between the two, one of the things that made it difficult for the Scottish Government, whether or not we thought it was desirable to take a different position, is if we may have had a different set of rules at, say, Glasgow Airport, but people, if they wanted to avoid those restrictions, could fly into London and travel up by rail or road. So it was an area where the differences in power and responsibility were often complicated by just the practical realities.
Yes, I think we've seen some documentation that suggests that that particular issue, going to Glasgow via Manchester or something like that, was an issue early on when travel was a big part of the decision making, and then it came back later on under Mr Yousaf's period as Cabinet Secretary for Health. Could we have a look, please, at INQ 0002925564? This is an exchange of emails which shows, we're going to page 6, please. So the page at the top, I think, indicates that the position here, as at the 20th of July, is that the Deputy First Minister was requesting a call to discuss international travel, and that there were a number of people who were involved in that. Page 6, please. Well, where's the passage? Is that all right? Go up there. Previous page, please. Sorry, Mr. Surgeon. Yeah, this is, we can see here that it's an email from the Deputy First Minister, Mr Swinney, to a number of people, including yourself. Is that right? Are we on the same page here? Yes, the 19th of July, Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary Education Skills 2, and there's a number of people listed there.
Oh yes,
one of whom is First Minister, and a number of others, some of whom actually we've heard from, Audrey McDougall, Roger Halliday, etc. And this is an email in which some details around the discussion which the Deputy First Minister had been interested in having on international travel, where it says, Ken, I'm extremely concerned about this. Spain is now being held to a much higher level of scrutiny and performance than other countries. If it is not added to the exemptions list, ministers will have to explain why not, when it has an estimated point prevalence rate of 0.015 compared to 0.33 when the decision not include was originally taken. 0.015 is verging on green. And there is visible action from the Spanish authorities to do whatever it takes to suppress outbreaks, compare and contrast with outbreaks in England. It won't matter how much ministers might justify it on health grounds. The Spanish government will conclude it is entirely political. They won't forget there is a real possibility they will never approve EU membership for an independent Scotland as a result. This is an email copied to you. To what extent were concerns about the possibility in the future that Spain would block an application for EU membership by an independent Scotland a factor in the decision-making around the Spanish travel corridor?
They weren't. For me, this email is copied to me. I assume I would have seen it at the time, but I remember very well the decision-making around this. I think it was around the 10th of July that travel corridors were introduced, and we had significant doubts about adding Spain to that because the prevalence of the virus at that time was higher in Spain than it was in Scotland, but that was moving, and over the next couple of weeks, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, that changed. Prevalence was reducing in Scotland, it actually was in Spain and rising in Scotland. These are decisions that were taken for public health reasons. They were difficult decisions, they were often very finely balanced decisions, and if that concern had been the one driving the decisions, then presumably at great criticism, not least from our own airport sector at the time, we wouldn't have kept Spain off the travel corridors in the first place.
Why is it, though, that there is discussion, if matters are being addressed solely on public health grounds, about the possibility that the Spanish government may conclude that there is a political aspect to things that they will not forget and that they may vote subsequently against EU membership for an independent Scotland? Why is that even part of the discussion?
It wasn't part of my consideration. I certainly, to the best of my knowledge, didn't have any discussion of that nature. I didn't write that email. I can't speak for other people as to why that was written in that way. What I can tell the inquiry, sitting here today answering questions, is that's not the basis on which the discussion took, not the way in which the decision was taken. These were finely balanced decisions on public health grounds that often, in fact not often, always, clinical advisors would be inputting their own opinions to as well.
Go to page 4, please. This is an email chain. Yes, and an email from Ken Thompson to a number of people. It says there, colleagues, you were mostly on the call with FM and other ministers just now. The FM agreed to a pause in which we were to give her advice on the implications for the Borders review of non-care home COVID cases currently being investigated. We have to do this rapidly, obviously. I'm proposing to write the outline of the advice to ministers and to ask some people to comment and contribute to that. Is the position then that there was on the 20th of July, shortly after this, quarantine requirements for Spain were lifted?
I don't have that date in front of me, but I know it was a relatively short space of time between the Scottish Government not lifting them and lifting them. But if memory serves me correctly, we then very quickly reapplied them. I think all of the countries in the UK
That's correct, as I understand it. On the 20th of July, I think what happened is that you agreed with other ministers that there should be a pause to the restriction, but that those were reimposed from the 26th of July.
The relative prevalence was changing at that point. We had reached a point where we thought on public health grounds that it was appropriate to add Spain to the travel corridors, and then the data obviously changed that position. Did the
consideration regarding the political implications connected to Spain mentioned in the previous email feature on the call that's been referred to?
Not that I can recall, so that is not my recollection.
But you were the one that made the decision to pause the restrictions, despite the fact that there was concerns about the data upon which such a public health decision might be made?
Well, at that point, the data had reached a position where we felt we could make that decision. I mean, I would suggest that had the consideration that appears in the previous email that was shown to me been guiding the decisions around this, we would not have taken the decision, which was extremely controversial at the time and attracted criticism, I think, from many people, and including very hefty criticism from airports in Scotland and airport in the city. We would not have done that in the first place. The fact that we were, in the face of that controversy, prepared to take a decision that was to continue to apply restrictions to Spain at a time when other parts of the UK were not doing that would, I hope, suggest that these were decisions being driven by data and public health considerations.
But the decision on the 20th of July was that quarantine requirements for Spain should be lifted, but then they were reimposed on the 26th.
And the data was, I mean, I don't know whether it's possible to put on the screen what the changing data around that time would have been. I remember that period. The data was changing. This is July 2020. We were, sadly, it was relatively short-lived, but we had reached a low point in cases in Scotland. At that point, Spain had been particularly high. That was the reason for our initial decision. Spain had taken, I think, further steps to suppress the virus. It was coming down there. I'm not sure whether at this point there was even the indication yet of cases starting to rise in Scotland. These were decisions that involved changing data, data that was often changing on a daily basis.
Can we look at page 2, please? And in this regard, again, Dr. Smith says that he asked for a view on the robustness of this data for Spain. There's been a remarkable change in the point prevalence from the set considered previously. It's difficult to reconcile with the public facing evidence of multiple large outbreaks in different areas of the country. And he asks whether can anyone offer an assessment of this. Now, the evidence, therefore, on a public health basis would tend to suggest that there had been multiple large outbreaks, which would not be consistent with the decision taken the next day to lift the quarantine. Is that correct?
No, actually, with respect, I read that differently to that. What I think Dr. Smith is saying here, although he would have to tell you what he meant, is that while we were seeing evidence of multiple large outbreaks in different areas of Spain, and that was what had driven our concern about having restrictions on Spain lifted, the point prevalence data was actually showing something different. It was showing a change that was suggesting that cases were coming down at that point. And not just my reading of this, my recollection of the discussions at the time is that what that is saying is that notwithstanding these very high profile outbreaks, the overall data for Spain shows that the risk is reducing, which was what was driving our decision around the 20th of July to lift restrictions before that data, I think, started to go in the wrong direction in Spain again.
So despite concerns about the robustness of the data in the face of evidence of multiple large outbreaks, you did open up the travel corridor to Spain, albeit only for a short period?
With respect, I do think the interpretation of this that's been put to me is not what this is saying. And I remember some of the discussions at the time is that the data, the point prevalence data, was no longer backing up the ongoing restrictions, that despite there appearing to be outbreaks, they were outbreaks in particular parts of the country, and the overall point prevalence data was showing that the risk from the virus in Spain was reducing. And actually, I do consider that this and the discussions that lay behind this were actually what was driving, not that this was contrary to the decision we took at that point, but that was part of what was driving that decision at that point.
But surely it doesn't make a lot of sense if there are issues about the robustness of the data to change the position. And in any event, we know that you had to change it back a few days later.
Mr Dawson, there was issues about the robustness of data at every step of the management of
But
this
would you not take a more precautionary
pandemic
approach if the changes in the data didn't seem to add up?
We were under a lot of pressure from airports at that point. We were under a lot of criticism for being an outlier at that point. I think we were at that point an outlier, and the data, the point prevalence data, was showing that we were no longer able to justify the position we were taking of more onerous restrictions on Spain, and that was the position. The data was particularly around comparisons between different countries. It was changing all the time. It was necessary to assess not just the overall data, but what lay behind that data. If it's what's been put to me here is that this was a politically driven decision, certainly on my part, it was absolutely not. And I come back to this: decisions that were taken by my government in this period. I hope many of them were right. I think some of the outcomes, in a relative sense, suggest that that would be the case. Some of them were undoubtedly wrong, but speaking for myself, none of them were driven by extraneous political considerations.
Could I go to INQ 000274143, please? You will recall that Mr Johnson visited Scotland on the 23rd of July 2020, Sturgeon?
I do.
Yes, and this is a tweet by you where you say, "I welcome the PM to Scotland today. One of the key arguments for independence is the ability of Scotland to take our own decisions rather than having our future decided by politicians we didn't vote for, taking us down a path we haven't chosen." His presence highlights that. This is a political tweet relating to your support for the cause of independence in July 2020, isn't it?
It is, but it's also a response to the Prime Minister at the time coming to Scotland and very overtly describing that visit as a mission to save the Union. I think he had first-person pieces in at least one newspaper ahead of that. Now, in reflection, should I have risen to the debate and posted that tweet? Probably not. But I would never even have been in that space at all, but for the pretext of the Prime Minister's visit. I was also, because he was coming to Scotland, because of the narrative that the UK government had put around his visit, I was inevitably being asked about it in my briefings and interviews. But yeah, perhaps I should have been the bigger person and not reacted in that way with that tweet.
I had intended, of course, to put to you also the context, which is that on his visit, and I think in the newspapers before, Mr Johnson has spoken about the might and merit of the Union, and therefore your interpretation of that is that he was seeking to politicise the situation. Is that right?
I think I say in my written statement, to be fair, I don't think generally the UK government tried to politicise the pandemic. I think this was a rare exception to that. If they did...
So you think this was?
I think Boris Johnson, not coming to Scotland per se, but coming to Scotland with the narrative that they put around that, was an exception to what I've said. That I think generally they didn't try to politicise the pandemic. And other than this occasion, the occasions where I thought they did, it was more around, Brexit and the vaccine rollout being possible because of Brexit. So it's not a general accusation I would have levelled at them. I think this was an exception. I listened to parts of Michael Gove's evidence earlier in the week and now realise that there may have been discussions at UK government level that led to this that I wasn't aware of at the time. Yeah. So this was a response. Was it as mature a response as with reflection I might have wished for? Perhaps not. But it wasn't. It wasn't me deciding suddenly to start talking about independence apropos of nothing. It was a response to the Prime Minister's visit and in particular the narrative of his visit.
Again, Ms Sturgeon, in fairness, I was also going to refer you to the paper that we took Mr Gove to, the State of the Union paper, which he delivered to the UK Cabinet on the 21st of July, 2 days before the visit, in which he described the risk to the Union as the greatest challenge for the UK government to confront, and said that protecting and strengthening the Union had to be the cornerstone of all that the UK government did. So I put to him that put some context, which of course you were not aware of at the time, to the visit. But your position, as I understand it, was that I may have politicised the pandemic, but he did it first.
No, I don't think I did politicise the pandemic at all. I responded to a particular narrative of his with a tweet and undoubtedly some answers to media questions. And the answers to media questions were unavoidable because I took lots of questions every day from journalists. The tweet, perhaps I shouldn't have, but I don't think a tweet adds up to politicising the pandemic. Perhaps I was just trying to defend the position against the claims that were being made.
Perhaps, though, the accumulation of evidence which we've looked at might suggest that there was an attempt on your part to politicise the pandemic.
I would strongly argue the reverse. And with respect to the evidence that's been put to me today is the evidence of that, I would say it demonstrates nothing of the sort.
In the period after the election, did you attempt to revive the campaign for a second independence referendum?
I think the work that on a second independence referendum did not restart in government until much later in 2021.
There was an announcement that you made in September.
September, which is some 6 months or more after the Scottish election.
What I'm interested in exploring is whether, in fact, there was within the Scottish Government an attempt to seek to do so before that. We went with Mr Thompson to an entry in his diary from a period in May 2021, shortly after the election, in which, amongst some reflections about his position and his future role within the Scottish Government, he wrote the words, "Indy back." Does that not suggest that it was a policy of the Scottish Government at that time to try to seek independence again, despite the fact that you made no announcement to that effect until September?
As a matter of fact, it was not the case that work on independence restarted at that point. We were still in a very challenging situation with COVID through the summer of 2021. So I heard Ken Thompson's answer to what that meant, that he was looking ahead to things that might be on the horizon for civil servants and the varying degrees of challenges they might be facing. As a matter of fact, independence work did not restart at that point. So at risk of contradicting somebody I've got the highest regard for at that point, Indy was not back.
I'd like to ask you some questions about the zero COVID or elimination strategy, which we've touched on already. You say in your statement, I was of the view that zero COVID in the period before a vaccine was available was an aim worth striving for. I knew that our circumstances, particularly if the rest of the UK was not following suit, meant it was unlikely to be completely achievable for any sustained period of time. Was there a zero COVID policy in the Scottish Government in the summer of 2020?
There was a maximum suppression strategy. I think the phraseology that was used, and it was in, if not our first strategic framework, then later iterations of that, was suppressed to the lowest possible level and keep it there. It is undoubtedly the case that we would have colloquially used terms like zero COVID and elimination, although emphatically not eradication, which was a very different concept, to describe that strategy in shorthand. Basically, what we and I was articulating, I on many occasions explained this at briefings and in response to questions. At no point was my belief that we would get COVID to a level where it was eliminated and went away. That would take a vaccine. But in the days before a vaccine and before effective treatments, when COVID, the direct harm of COVID was so severe, we needed to suppress it as far as possible, both to protect life, but also to create the conditions where we could start to safely open up the economy and society, and that the best way of achieving maximum suppression was to try to drive it as low or as close to zero as possible. And that was the position of the Scottish Government, certainly throughout the summer of 2020. That strategic objective changed later, I think around about the spring, early summer of 2021, when we got to the position where growing and significant numbers of the population were vaccinated.
On the 14th of April 2020, the Scottish COVID Advisory Group provided a formal advice entitled Lockdown Review, in which the government was advised that it was the group's advice that in the context of there being no vaccine or specific drug treatments available to prevent or treat COVID-19, and to quote, we do not believe that it will be possible for the foreseeable future to eradicate the SARS-CoV-2 virus, henceforth virus. We need to find ways of living with the virus as best as possible, which includes protecting the NHS and social care capacity to care for citizens. Around this time, what planning did the Scottish Government have about the prospect or the requirement that had been advised by the COVID Advisory Group that there would need to be found ways of living with the virus?
We were already actively planning for that, and in fact off the back of the kind of advice that was coming through, we published in late April 2020 our strategic framework for decision making. There were other publications with more detail on that through May, and then of course at I think on the 28th or later in May, round about that time, we published the route map for exiting lockdown, which set out different phases of lifting the restrictions and therefore opening up and starting to live with the virus while keeping it, to use an expression for shorthand, as under control as we could. The word eradication appears in that advice. I just want to stress it was never, eradication and elimination mean very different things. In preparation for today, I came across the way I articulated the elimination strategy in a briefing, I think in June 2020, where I say explicitly, elimination is not eradication. It is about getting the virus to the lowest levels you can, which doesn't mean it has gone away and doesn't mean it won't rise again. but it gives us more confidence that we can keep it under control with surveillance, testing and contact tracing, and with targeted measures as opposed to blanket lockdowns. That's what was meant by it. It was a way of, all through this, we got it, including from the COVID advisory group and certainly from SAGE. As we came out of lockdown, we had to come out of it in a way that avoided the R number going above 1 again. And people will recall references across all the governments at the time to how much headroom we had, and therefore we had to open up in a phased way. And that's what we were trying to do. Open up, learn to live with the virus, but keep it under control so that it didn't take off again and start overwhelming us in the way that it had in previous in the early stages. That was a very difficult balance to strike. It involved lots of judgments about what could open, what had to stay closed, what the phasing of that was, but that's what we were trying to achieve.
Can I just check that we've got the note correct, because that is what I understood you to say. Did you say elimination and eradication are different things?
Yes.
Aren't they the same thing?
No. In this sort of epidemiological, I think you will find comments from Gregor Smith and comments he's made. I came across one in a committee in the Scottish Parliament that we both appeared at. Eradication effectively means you get to a point where the disease has gone away and it's not a risk anymore. With COVID, that was likely and understood likely to only come with vaccines. Elimination was effectively, as I put it there, it doesn't mean it's gone away, it doesn't mean it won't rise again. You're taking measures to try to keep it at a level as close to no cases as possible, but it doesn't mean that if you lift those measures, it won't start to transmit again. So in epidemiological terms, I'm not an expert on this. Other people can explain it much better than me.
But it sounds like people are playing fast and loose with the language. But
well, I was trying, obviously not as successfully as I hoped to. I read out a quote there from a briefing in June 2020, where I'm obviously being asked these very questions, and I start by saying elimination is not eradication. I didn't come to that conclusion myself. That was the
expert advice.
The expert advice that was being given to me.
Language in this regard is, of course, important, Ms Sturgeon, isn't it?
Very much so, and I always tried to be as precise as I could in my language, hence explanations like that. I am not suggesting for a second I always succeeded.
Because the language of zero COVID and elimination or eradication permeated the public's understanding of what the objective was, didn't it?
In that we were trying to get to a point where we were suppressing the virus as much as possible.
But the word suppression wasn't the word that was generally used by the Scottish Government at this time, was it?
I believe, and it's my opinion, and others will take a different view, I think the level of understanding of the public at that time was very sophisticated, and I think there was an understanding of what was being talked about, what was meant. Language is really important, but sometimes, one of the things I think I was perhaps criticised for on the day of lockdown was calling it an effective lockdown. When the Prime Minister at the time didn't use the term lockdown, I took the view that we needed to communicate with people in language that they were using themselves, that they could understand, that we could then make sure was defined. So I think there was an understanding of what was meant by that we couldn't make COVID go away, but we could keep it at levels that wouldn't overwhelm us, get contact tracing and surveillance and testing back so that it was allowing us, as for much of 2020, from through the autumn of 2020 before the Alpha variant came, we managed to do through particular outbreaks, outbreak control, then the levels system that we used for a period. We were having a degree, not complete, but a degree of success in that, and that was only possible because we had got over the summer the virus to a sufficiently low level to allow those approaches to be successful.
The language is important, Ms Sturgeon, because the language of elimination or eradication rather than maximum suppression, which is a phrase you're using just now, gave people the impression that COVID was over, didn't it?
I genuinely and very firmly don't believe that was the impression at any point in Scotland over that period. To be clear, I never used the term eradication. I was at pains when asked about it, to be clear, I wasn't talking about eradication. But I don't believe that was the view in Scotland over
Well, Ms Sturgeon, you know perfectly well that people jumped on planes to Spain and this caused the second wave.
Well, we've just been talking about how we tried to, deal in a way that was cautious around travel to other countries, including Spain. Some people went on holiday that summer. I think many people didn't. I think many people tried. Many people wouldn't have gone on holiday at all. Many people who did stayed in Scotland and holidayed at home. Some people would have gone overseas. I genuinely don't believe that was because people thought, the majority of people thought COVID had gone away. I stood up every day and reminded people COVID hadn't gone away and wasn't going to suddenly and magically go away. And I think there was a very high degree of understanding. And I've talked earlier on about criticism, perhaps, and I don't mean this as a criticism of them. Some of our sternest critics over this period were the airport sector, who felt that my messaging in Scotland was actually making it, was discouraging people from going on foreign holidays at a time when they thought they were being encouraged in perhaps other parts of the UK.
You wanted to have the reputation, did you not, of the person who had driven COVID out of Scotland?
I'd never thought I was capable of driving COVID out of Scotland. I hoped that the decisions my government would take would keep COVID at the lowest possible level so that it took the lives of fewer people, minimised the disruption to people's livelihoods and the education of children. The thing I find, I guess, forgive me, I appreciate I'm here to answer your questions, I'm not. I accept this, that there will be genuine and serious scrutiny about the content of decisions that were taken, and some of those decisions I wish my government had taken differently. Some, I think, were right. My motives in this were only ever about trying to do the right thing to minimise the overall harm that the virus was doing. The toll it took in Scotland, as in other parts of the UK, was far too high, so I didn't do that as successfully as I wish I had been able to. But perhaps in some ways, the measures we took had some impact. Professor Serene Diamond, the UK statistician's evidence to this inquiry, looking at the quite significant lower deaths in terms of COVID-19 on an age standardised basis in Scotland than in other parts of the UK, still far too high. We were always trying to protect people and to minimise harm in all of its forms. And the nature and the content and the substance of those decisions deserve to be scrutinised as closely as possible. It genuinely, I take it very, very personally when people question the very motives, because I know that the motives were absolutely in good faith and for the best reasons.
Your desire to be the person that drove COVID out of Scotland was the reason why you entered into direct Twitter messaging with Professor Sridhar, whom Professor Morris, the chair of the COVID group, has told us was in a minority of one in being the only person on that group who thought that COVID could be driven out of Scotland at that time.
I don't think that is a fair representation of her view, but I'm not here to speak for her. Can I just say, I didn't, this wasn't about my reputation as the person who drove COVID out of Scotland. I desperately wanted to minimise the harm of COVID in Scotland. I was not under any illusions about the reality of the situation we faced. I reached out to Professor Sridhar, I think for two main reasons. One was that she was a member of the advisory group, but she was also somebody, I think, to her great credit, who was seeking to communicate through the media messages that she thought was important regularly. As a result of that, I was periodically being asked for my response to views she'd expressed, and I wanted to, make sure I understood where she was coming from. She was also, I knew, very plugged into the responses in different countries. I think she had connections into the WHO the government of New York at the time and other countries. And I was at that stage, I just wanted to understand as much as I could about the pandemic, about other countries' approaches. It was part of a process of me just trying to make sure I wasn't missing anything, I wasn't overlooking anything, and that while I wasn't trying to elevate one voice over others, I was wanting to make sure that if she was a minority voice, that I wasn't losing a different perspective, that I was able to hear, that it wasn't being lost in the consensus, that I was able to hear the diversity of views. And again, you know, the motives were only, whatever mistakes and misjudgments I might have made, the motives were only about trying to equip myself as well as I could to do the job that I was in the position of having to do.
Your messages with her demonstrate a coordination of the two of yours media strategy. What you were trying to equip yourself with was the view of a scientist who would support your view that elimination was possible, even although she was in a minority of one on your COVID advisory group.
I don't believe that the messages, well, whatever the impression the messages might give, I know there was no coordination of media strategy. My media strategy was fairly obvious and well established. She was speaking in the media. Generally, there was an alignment. I wanted the Scottish Government to be suppressing COVID as much as possible, and whether, you know, she believed that could go further than others believed it could, and that I believed it could. Generally, the thrust of those messages was in vein with what the advice to me was, and to the messages we were communicating to the public.
She frequently runs what she intends to say in the press and in press interviews by you in order to ensure that your positions are aligned.
The volume of Professor Shridar's media output would suggest that if she ever did that, it was on a very small number of occasions. But also in terms of, I would very, very frequently in the question and answers that followed my daily briefings, be asked about her views. So some of what you're reading in messages about and putting to me as coordination was simply, you know, flagging up things she'd said in order that I knew what it was when I was asked about it. I come back to a point I keep making. My decisions and judgments can and should be scrutinised. My motives were never anything other than just trying to do the best I could in a situation that at times, I'm sure for every decision maker, felt as close to impossible as I've ever experienced.
The focus on the elimination strategy took the Scottish Government's eye off the need to prepare for a second wave, which experts would have told you was inevitable, did it not?
We knew a second wave was almost inevitable, as close to inevitable as anything was. No, it didn't.
Preparation was done for it.
That I don't accept that is the case. We, through the autumn of 2020, we went from lockdown to an opening up of the country through the route map rather that we'd set out at the end of May. We got to a point where we couldn't go to the final phase of that because of the epidemiology at the time. We then had a period where instead of reimposing measures, we were able to deal with outbreaks. We had some very localised outbreaks. We dealt with them through specific measures, and then the level system was applied. And actually, contrary to we didn't do anything to prepare for a second wave, we had continued to build up the testing and contact tracing capacity there that was a necessary part of trying to mitigate and minimise a second wave and deal with that as it happened. As it happened, the second, we didn't go into a second lockdown in November 2020 in Scotland. The second lockdown in Scotland came when the Alpha variant came along. So I don't accept that our eye was off the ball. I think we were taking difficult decisions reaching difficult balances in the best way we possibly could. And I think the evidence overall is that while our response was far from avoiding all of the horrible, horrendous harm that was done, I would say an assessment of the outcomes overall suggests that while our approach was far from perfect, it actually managed to mitigate some harm that perhaps wasn't mitigated in some other places.
In his statement to this module, Professor Mark Woolhouse states at paragraph 345 that the start of the vaccine rollout, vaccine campaign, which you'll remember, Ms Sturgeon, started towards the end of 2020 and into 2021, created a false impression that the pandemic would soon be over and described it as over-optimistic. Professor Sridhar, when we looked at your direct messages with her, when I asked her why the messages had stopped at the end of 2020, gave the answer that when the vaccine arrived, input of the nature that I had been providing with regard to fighting the virus was no longer necessary. Was it your view and that of the Scottish Government that the pandemic would soon be over as a result of the arrival of the vaccine?
No. The pandemic is, we're no longer in a pandemic, but people are dying from COVID every week as we speak. Last year, I think 2,000 people died of COVID. COVID has not gone away. Arguably, COVID will never go away. And I have never believed otherwise. In fact, I at points faced criticism for almost suggesting the alternative. I was criticised at points for being the voice of doom around COVID. What happened with the vaccine was that we entered a different phase. We entered a phase where, unlike the situation until that point, we haven't talked yet, I don't know whether we will, about the Scottish Government's four harms approach. We had no way of mitigating harm one, which was the direct health impact of COVID. So we had to, albeit trying to minimise harm overall, we had to have a particular focus on reducing harm one and harm two to some extent as well. When the vaccine came along, we had a way of mitigating harm one without restrictions, which allowed us then to rebalance towards harms 3 and 4. So we entered a very different phase of the pandemic because of the impact of vaccination. And that's why across all of the 4 nations, we put such a great emphasis on, as fast as possible, a rollout of the vaccination campaign.
Could I ask you to have a look, please, at INQ 000334792? Returning to exchange between Mr. Youssef and Professor Leach, this time on the 10th of June 2021, pages 12 to 13.
Forgive me, I'm not seeing it.
Sorry, yes, we'll just get it up. My apologies. So again, this is an exchange in June of 2021. You may recall, Ms Sturgeon, that which we looked at this with the current First Minister, one of the characteristics of the fight against the virus in 2021 was that there were a number of large events which ran the risk of spreading the virus, and decisions needed to be taken around whether those should be allowed to go ahead or not. This was a discussion in particular around the decision making with regard to the possibility of cancelling a fan zone which had been put together for the Euros in Glasgow, which it was eventually allowed to go ahead. And the exchange says at 11:45, Professor Leach says, and still it goes on, FM wants more advice. Her instinct says cancel fan zone. Her office will write back, which Ken is writing to ask for more, and then Ken will gather legal, etc. to reply. Mr. Youssef says, yes, she messaged me this morning, wants more detail from GCC around costs involved if we cancel. And then there's some discussion around how much it would cost. £6 million is mentioned. And then at 11:53, Mr. Youssef says, £6 million seems cheap for 31 days. Wonder if that factors in costs of food and beverage suppliers would have expected to make over the course of the fan zone, may look for compensation. Either way, if FM is going to cancel, needs to be done soon. she could hold the line and see how we get on and what the scenes on Monday look like. If people behave, then that might settle her nerves. Professor Leach, yep, I think that's costs, not profit. And he says she needs to do it before or at FMQs, if at all. And then Mr. Youssef says, I'll tell you what, from knowing her for 15 years, it is not often her instincts are wrong. Both Professor Leach and Mr. Youssef, the then Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care, seem to be describing the ultimate decision taken in connection with the possible cancellation of this event as a matter which will be governed by your instincts. That's how you made decisions during the course of the pandemic, wasn't it, Ms Sturgeon?
I think had the fan zone been cancelled, that is certainly an accusation that based on this exchange could have been made of me. But the fan zone wasn't cancelled, therefore my instinct didn't govern the decision. That was my instinct. I was, the Euros delayed by a year were happening. The fan zone did make me very nervous about people coming together in that way, given what we were dealing with. That was my instinct. I asked for further advice and consideration. That advice came back, and I was persuaded on the basis of the advice that my instinct was not what we should go with. We should go with the advice, and that is the position. You have in managing a situation like this, you have instincts about what's sensible and what's not sensible in a whole host of things. If I had made decisions purely on the basis of that, then that would have been deeply misguided. But I didn't. I had an instinct. I probed the question. I asked for advice through proper channels. I considered that advice carefully, and on the basis of that, agreed that it should go ahead. And as it turns out, I think it was the right decision to allow it to go ahead, because it did not, the risk that I'd been worried about did not materialise.
Would you agree with the proposition, Ms Sturgeon, that the Scottish Government's pandemic strategy was run on your instincts?
No.
Decisions were ultimately made not by Cabinet, but by you and a small band of trusted advisers.
As I've said earlier on, I think the evidence before the inquiry of the Cabinet papers and the Cabinet minutes show that that is not the case. I was the First Minister. I had a responsibility to lead, to try to see the whole picture when Cabinet Secretaries, rightly and properly, are focused on their own portfolio interests. In any leadership position, you have instincts. You learn to trust, or also to know when not to trust your instincts. But as this exchange, again, I would say, if this exchange had ended with her instinct is to cancel the fan zone, and at 12 o'clock at First Minister's Questions I had stood up and announced the cancellation of the fan zone, that would prove, I think, the proposition you're putting to me. But it didn't. I had an instinct. I tested it with the experts. I asked for advice. I considered that advice. And on the basis of that advice, decided the opposite of what my instinct had started out telling me.
Part of your instinct is based on a desire to seek to advance this cause of Scottish independence, isn't it?
Not in the management of the pandemic. I don't think it's any. I don't think I'm breaking any news today to say that I have spent a lifetime campaigning for independence. I will no doubt continue to campaign for independence. I know I will. But when in a position of leadership and decision-making, you are confronted with a global pandemic, and as I remember sitting one night in probably February 2020 in Bute House with a set of reasonable worst-case scenario figures in front of me and a figure for the potential number of deaths that might unfold, which thankfully didn't unfold at that level, my instincts became something completely different. In that moment, my only instinct, and the instinct I brought to the management of the pandemic, was how do I lead a government that makes the best possible decisions in horrific circumstances to try to minimise the harm that this virus is going to do. And people will make their own judgments about me, about my government, about my decisions, but for as long as I live, I will carry the impact of these decisions. I will carry regret at the decisions and judgments I got wrong. But I will always know in my heart and in my soul that my instincts and my motivation was nothing other than trying to do the best in the face of this pandemic.
It was your instinct to seek to create a difference between your approach and that of the UK government, despite the obvious need in the face of the virus for a collaborative strategy, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't. It was my instinct to do everything I thought was necessary and appropriate to minimise harm to the people of Scotland. That was my instinct. And where that necessitated being different to the UK government, it was more important to me that we did what we thought in Scotland was right than it was in aligning with decisions we thought were wrong and would potentially increase harm rather than minimise harm. I feel to my core that the number of lives lost to this pandemic were far too high. We were never going to be able to get through a pandemic with no loss of life. I think it was far too high. I think the other impacts were far too high, and every death is a tragedy that I regret, and that people in this room and outside across the country are living with the grief and trauma of. So we didn't do as well as I wish we were able to. I think I quoted the evidence to the inquiry from Serene Diamond. On the age standardised mortality measure, the one that he says is legitimate, the deaths in Scotland were significantly lower than in other parts of the UK, far, far too high. But that says to me that even if it was only at the margins, our decision-making managed to minimise the harm to some extent. And that was my duty.
It was your instinct to seek to move away from existing structures which had been designed to try to manage procedures in this type of situation, like COBRA and SAGE, and to form your own.
I would have, if I can address SAGE and COBRA, it wasn't my decision when COBRA met, how often it met. I wish COBRA had continued to meet. The Prime Minister at the time decided not to have COBRA meetings. I wasn't able to convene COBRA meetings at my own hand, and so I am not responsible for the frequency of COBRA meetings. SAGE, I thought SAGE did a very good job during the pandemic. At the outset of the pandemic, I thought the quality of advice coming from SAGE was very high. I had two concerns about it, or about having that as the sole source of advice. One was, understandably, and this is not a criticism, its advice was not necessarily tailored to the demographics, the health profile, the epidemiology in Scotland. And secondly, I had no ability, I didn't even know at the start of the pandemic who was on SAGE. I had no ability as a First Minister to speak directly to people on SAGE, to ask them questions, to deepen my understanding. So I asked for an advisory group to be established in Scotland, not to replace SAGE, but to help fill those gaps. SAGE and the advisory group, through, and put on record my deep thanks to Andrew Morris, who chaired the advisory group, it established reciprocity. So Andrew became a member of SAGE, papers were shared. It was not seeking to replace SAGE, it was augmenting and supplementing SAGE, so that I felt the functions that SAGE wasn't able to perform for the Scottish Government were delivered in that way.
It was your instinct to be seen to be following a different path from the UK Government and to seek to get your word in public first, wasn't it?
No.
It was your instinct to keep decision-making secret and as regards the way that decisions were ultimately reached, the process by which they were made, recorded and retained?
No. I think delivered more than 250 public addresses over the course of the pandemic where I answered, people will judge the quality of my answers in the way that they want, but answered questions. I didn't take one or two questions, I answered every question that came to me. I sought at every stage to be open, to be transparent, to level with the public about the complexity of this, the difficulties, the almost impossible balances we were trying to strike, and what we were taking into account in coming to the decisions we were coming to.
It was your instinct to think that you knew best, rendering the published strategies of the government and the apparent advisory structures around you nothing more than, to use Mark Woolhouse's words, rhetoric.
Absolutely not. We implemented the strategies of the government to the extent that the virus allowed us to. We changed and adapted them in line with how the virus was operating. I was reviewing some of the minutes of the COVID advisory group last night in preparation for today, and the minutes frequently have the Scottish Government officials reporting about how highly I valued the advice of the group, and them saying how much they valued the opportunities through the deep dives for us to speak together and for me to ask them questions and for them to be able to help. I was assisted. I did not know best. That's why I sought to take advice from as broad a range of people as I could. It's why I reached out to people like Professor Sridhar. It's why I read everything I could get my hands on. I did not know best. And I was assisted at every step by first-class clinical and medical and scientific advisors, by senior civil servants, principally in the Scottish Government, but let me put on record that was the case on the part of many people in the UK Government, people like Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, Jonathan Van Tam, people who were hugely helpful to me and to the Scottish Government and advisors, and I would not have been able to get through the task I had without their advice and expertise that I benefited from on a daily basis.
It was your instinct to seek to portray yourself as open and honest with the public, but at the same time to keep from them important elements of the management, such as the Nike conference, care home deaths, and the advice around the rugby, which allowed COVID into Scotland in the first place.
I am not sure that last statement would be established by facts, but I stand to be corrected. The Public Health Scotland genomic survey study that was done later in 2020 that looked at the different ways in which COVID came into Scotland. I don't think it would be reasonable to draw from that the statement that the rugby brought the virus into Scotland, but I stand to be corrected on that if I am wrong. I've tried to explain as fully as I can the decision making around Nike. The reasons for that, the legitimate reasons for that, but how I think it is reasonable that people think that was the wrong judgment. I keep saying there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of pages of cabinet papers and cabinet minutes that set out, if that was all that was available on the record, sets out a comprehensive, full and detailed explanation of the decisions we reached, the choices we faced and the reasons that drove our decision making.
The people of Scotland deserve better than a pandemic strategy run on your instincts, did they not, Ms Sturgeon?
They did indeed, which is why they didn't get a pandemic run on my instincts.
We started these evidential hearings a couple of weeks ago with oral evidence from Mrs Jane Morrison, a representative of the Scottish COVID bereaved group whose wife died of COVID acquired in a hospital in October 2020. Mrs Morrison and her group had sought answers about matters of significant concern to them and about the pandemic in a meeting with you in March 2021. They did not get them. In the statement of the Scottish COVID bereaved to the inquiry, the remaining representatives of many who died, these words appear: hubris does not stop a pandemic. The story of COVID in Scotland is the story of the hubris of Nicola Sturgeon, is it not?
No, I do not believe that to be the case. I am in the fortunate position of not having personally lost anyone to COVID. I wish with every fibre of my being that the decisions my government have been able to take could have reduced the number of people in Scotland today who did lose someone to COVID. And I am deeply sorry to each and every bereaved person and each and every person who suffered in other ways. I did my best, my government did our best, and people will judge that but I know that every day I tried my best and those working with me tried our best to steer this country through the COVID pandemic in the best way we could.
Thank you, Ms Sturgeon. I have no further questions. There are some questions from Scottish.
I think Mr McCaffrey has some questions.
Ms Sturgeon, I'm instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of Scottish COVID bereaved. With reference to your statement, which is found at INQ 000339033, and your evidence this morning that you wish to deepen your knowledge about the virus, I'd like to take you to paragraph 149, subparagraph B of that statement, and this relates to you inquiring as to the possibility of asymptomatic transmission. You'll see there that it says, whether COVID-19 could be spread person to person asymptomatically, the initial advice I received was that asymptomatic transmission was not possible. My private office replied on my behalf and at my request with the following query. First Minister read information online in the last 24 hours, including references to an article in yesterday's Lancet, suggesting the opposite of this. That is, that people may be infectious before being symptomatic. What is the very certain statement in paragraph 14 based on? I received further advice from Public Health Scotland on the 25th of January. This included the following extracts. It is likely that person-to-person transmission, when it does occur, mostly involves transmission of virus from people with symptoms and infected people with symptoms. For example, someone who's coughing, are much more likely to spread virus around than someone who is infected but free of symptoms. The evidence and advice on asymptomatic transmission remained uncertain until around April or May 2020, after which there seemed to be more of an acceptance that asymptomatic transmission was an issue. So my question, Ms Sturgeon, is therefore, why then, if by that date you knew that asymptomatic transfer was possible, would you consider that releasing people from hospital to care homes, but only testing if they had symptoms, was any protection at all? And on the basis of this advice received from Public Health Scotland that asymptomatic transmission was a possibility, why was it maintained that there was any uncertainty about this issue? Would it therefore not have been prudent to have erred on the side of safety?
Thank you. If I can very briefly, as you can see from my evidence there and the extracts from advice and my responses to that advice, if I can summarise, I think, as it can be seen there, the issue of uncertainty was not so much a binary one of was there or was there not the possibility of asymptomatic transmission. The uncertainty was the extent to which that was a serious issue, and certainly the advice that came to me, and I think the advice from the WHO until certainly into the spring, perhaps early summer of 2020, was that there was uncertainty and disagreement about whether it was a very small risk or a much more substantial risk, and that was uncertain. However, notwithstanding uncertainty around asymptomatic transmission, what there also was, and certainly an advice that came to the Scottish Government, was an uncertainty about the reliability of testing in people who either were asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic. So there was a concern, and it wasn't a suggestion that testing was not important, but there was a concern. And this was a concern that was still being expressed to the Scottish Government when, in April, when the Cabinet Secretary changed the position to testing of all admissions from care homes, from hospitals to care homes. There was a concern that testing on its own could give rise to false assurance. Somebody who tested negative may still have the virus if they were asymptomatic. That is why the early advice around care homes focused very much on isolation and keeping people separate. And notwithstanding the limited availability of the testing at the time, there was a concern that testing on its own would not be sufficient to guard against those risks. On care homes in particular, I think there are very serious issues for all of us to reflect on here. Testing is undoubtedly a significant part of that. Discharges from hospitals in particular are a very serious part of that. And I'm not shying away from that. But I also think there are other issues around care homes, and all of which the Scottish Government has to take responsibility for, that we mustn't lose sight of in a focus only on testing. The report that Public Health Scotland did later in 2020 about discharges from hospital showed that almost all care homes in Scotland over that period from March through to May had discharges from hospital. But only a third of those care homes had an outbreak of COVID or had residents who died from COVID. So that suggests that, yes, discharges and the circumstances of discharges must be looked at seriously. But that would suggest, and the number of deaths were very heavily concentrated in relatively small numbers of care homes. So there are other issues, I think, that we need to probe very, very seriously around the structure and the size of the care home sector, the resources and the regulation in care homes. These are all profoundly important issues. Testing is a significant and important part of that, but my view is that there are other aspects of that that we must also make sure we consider in the course of a fuller examination around the situation in care homes.
Well, that just goes back to the latter part of the question, that with all that uncertainty and the lack of capacity in testing, would it not have been prudent to err on the side of safety and not discharge to care homes?
When we were in the early part of the pandemic, and I'm talking here about late February into March 2020, the objective was where somebody didn't have the medical need to be in hospital, it was better for them to be discharged. I mean, that is generally true at all times, but we were watching on television in countries like Italy, hospitals filling up with COVID patients. So yes, we wanted to make sure we had available capacity in our hospitals to deal with people who needed hospital treatment, but there was also a concern that hospitals would not have been safe in terms of the virus for vulnerable people who didn't need to be in hospital. I do not think we got everything right around care homes, and I deeply regret that. But I also know that it wasn't the case that we didn't think about the best way to try to protect people in care homes. The guidance, there were undoubtedly flaws and deficiencies in that guidance, but the advice at that time was that isolation, keeping people as separate as possible, it was the best way to protect people in care homes. Now, clearly, that didn't have the effect that we wanted it to. Of all of the important issues around this pandemic, the situation in care homes is one of the most important to properly scrutinise and understand. I suppose, simply saying that I think testing is an important part of that, but I think for me, it raises a lot of other issues about care homes, the care home sector, how the ways in which we sought to protect people and the effectiveness of that. And I think it is in the interest, and it's a duty to those who are bereaved, who have lost people in care homes, that we do understand that in the fullest possible way.
Thank you. Could I maybe ask you just to try and keep your responses as short as possible? Obviously, we're limited in time, and we want to get through as many questions as we can. Moving on to document reference INQ 000370312, and that should come up on screen at page 4 of that document. Didn't your inquiries at the end of January, when Public Health Scotland explained that asymptomatic transfer could occur in response to your question about it, mean that you did indeed know about asymptomatic transfer at the relevant time? So the phrase quoted there that we see on screen, "and we didn't know what we know now about asymptomatic transmission," was in fact incorrect?
No, perhaps it's not as fully expressed there as I've had the opportunity to do to you today. if you go back to the statement you showed me a moment ago, it was actually me who first queried a briefing saying, I don't think it is right to say that asymptomatic transmission cannot happen. So it wasn't that we didn't know asymptomatic transmission couldn't happen, but we didn't know at the outset what we came to know, that it was potentially a significant driver. The response that came back to me from Health Protection Scotland, as it was then, still was saying they thought it was overwhelmingly likely that it was people with symptoms who would transmit. So we didn't know everything we came to know about asymptomatic transmission when I made that statement, but that's not the same thing as saying we didn't know anything about it.
Were you aware of any recommendations made by Scottish Care in March 2020 in relation to the need for robust clinical assessment and testing of residents entering care homes, both from the community and acute NHS settings? And if so, how did this affect your decision making?
I was aware of comments and recommendations that Scottish Care and other organisations and bodies were making. I don't know whether I was aware of the specific ones you're quoting to me there. We sought to factor all of that into our decision making. We extended testing to care homes and to a range of other settings as we built up testing capacity. However, we didn't think that it was ever safe to rely only on testing, for the reasons that even if we accept asymptomatic transmission happens, there is and was doubt about the reliability of tests to detect the virus in people who were asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic. When I was preparing for today's session, on the day, I think the 21st of April, when Jean Freeman made the statement in Parliament extending testing to all admissions from hospital to care homes, the advice that was still coming to us at that point was sceptical about testing and a concern that it would take away a focus on isolation and other infection prevention and control means. And so we factored all of this into our decision making, and on this, as on other things, tried to make the best decisions that we could in the circumstances we were in at the time.
Were you aware of recommendations made in April 2020 to the Scottish Government in relation to the restriction on visiting care homes being increasingly disproportionate and failing to meet the pastoral needs and care needs of individuals, and the traumatic effect this was having on families? And if so, how did this affect your decision-making process?
In my experience and recollection, the issue of care home visiting was one of the most difficult because I was aware of the increasing distress and trauma, both to care home residents and to their loved ones, of restrictions on visiting. And that was an issue on which we were always trying to strike a balance between opening up and allowing much more flexibility in terms of visiting, but trying to guard against infection being in homes. I don't think we got that right, possibly at all, but it was not because we didn't care, it was not because we didn't try to get that right. And I have had in the past, I have at the moment, relatives in care homes myself. I understand, or I think I can understand how awful that would have been for any family with a loved one in a care home at that time.
And when the United Kingdom government changed its policy in relation to care home testing on the 15th of April 2020, why did that not cause the Scottish Government to consider its position or review it?
We were considering and reviewing our position at that time. I think I'm getting the date right, that on the 21st of April, Jean Freeman announced a range of different things, including care home testing. So our position was under a constant, ongoing review and assessment at that time.
It is clear from the necessity of setting up the nosocomial review group in May 2020 that the Scottish Government realised that hospital-acquired infection was a particular risk. Can you explain why it was decided to set up this body early in the pandemic?
Because we understood, both from the emerging experience in COVID, but also from wider experience around hospital infection, the particular risks of nosocomial infection in hospitals, and we were seeking to make sure that on an ongoing basis there was expert advice and consideration given to how those risks could be reduced in hospitals.
Just going back to your statement, which I didn't take you to again, we looked at the beginning of questioning. In paragraph 455, you refer to the advice at that time was that the limitations of PCR testing for asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic cases may result in false assurance, and therefore the focus should be on infection prevention and control measures. Further, that the fact that there was limited availability of testing capacity in March 2020 and the World Health Organization guidance at the time was clear that testing all hospital discharges was not the best use of available capacity while it was still being expanded. And yet very frail people with complex needs were being moved in circumstances where you were aware of the problems of asymptomatic transfer, pre-symptomatic transfer, and the problems of false assurance. Why, therefore, was it considered in all these circumstances safer to move them at all? And would you have taken the same decision again, knowing what you know now? And if not, what would you have done differently and why?
I would desperately try to find ways of managing the situation of elderly people in hospital who didn't have a medical need to be in hospital differently, that would have if not prevented, because in the face of what we were dealing with, I'm not sure prevention absolutely would ever have been possible, but to mitigate and minimise beyond what happened in reality. I would do everything in my power, and I wish I could turn the clock back and do different things that would have reduced the loss of life in care homes. But it wouldn't have changed a situation where leaving people in hospitals would not have been an option that was without risk. There was nosocomial infection in hospital. There were COVID patients in hospital. We didn't, thankfully, face the overwhelming of hospitals in the way that had been seen in other countries at the start of the pandemic. But hospitals would not have been a risk-free environment for vulnerable people either, and that's the context in which these decisions had to be made. And I desperately wish we could have had the ability to do things in a way that didn't result in the outcome that did materialise.
And wouldn't the retention of those patients in hospital have been the best place to meet their medical needs rather than discharging them to care homes where they were putting other vulnerable people in harm's way? Anybody
who had a medical need to be in hospital should have been in hospital. We were talking about discharge of people who didn't have a medical need to be in hospital, and discharge to their own home or to a care home was considered to be was considered to be better than keeping them in a hospital environment that in itself would not have been without risk of COVID transmission. That was the advice at the time. These were the judgments that were made at the time. And yes, I think it would have been, I wish we had been able to introduce testing earlier, more comprehensively. But I don't think that in and of itself would have removed the risks of care home admission. And that's why I'm saying I think there are a variety of other issues that also need to be properly considered in terms of the circumstances of discharge to care homes. But I don't think I can sit here and say that keeping people in hospital would have been without risks, or certainly that at that time would not have seemed to me to be the situation.
One final question, Ms Sturgeon. Were there any discussions about what would happen if the criminal trial of the former First Minister Alex Salmond was still ongoing at the time of lockdown? And did the fact that it was have any effect of the timing of the lockdown being put in place in Scotland?
No.
Thank you, my lady. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Mr McCaffrey. That completes the evidence for today.
Yes, thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much, Sturgeon. I don't know if I can guarantee that we won't be calling upon you again, but I know we've already called upon you twice, but it's probably unlikely, but thank you anyway for your help today. I notice some members of the public gallery are distressed. Please don't forget there is support available if you need it. Very well, 10 o'clock tomorrow, please.
Thank you, my lady.